Today we're stepping into the realm of climate change. Last class we explored land and energy. Today we move on to land and climate change. You might be surprised to discover the strong link between these two and how SLM plays a pivotal role in reducing greenhouse gases and bringing resilience to both farming and ecosystems at large. I'll begin with some observations about the environment generally and then on to climate change itself. We'll look at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions and how land degradation contributes to those, and then some impacts of climate change. After that, we'll turn it around and show how SLM can have a direct impact on both reducing climate change through mitigation and helping people adapt to its impacts. Environmental issues are factual, but there are emotions involved too. Some people are pessimists, others are optimists. When I was at university at the beginning of the 1970s, there was a surge in concern about the environment. I kept one copy of a magazine, which I still have, and here's a quote that impressed me deeply. But climate change was not a worry at that time. Most of us simply didn't know about it. If current trends are allowed to persist, the breakdown of society and the irreversible disruption of the life support system on this planet, possibly by the end of the century, certainly within the lifetime of our children, are inevitable. However, some 30 years later, Bjorn Lomborg caused quite a stir with his book The Skeptical Environmentalist, where he challenged the doomsayers. His point was that the world, in many ways, had actually become a better place for humankind, but there was quite a negative reaction to his ideas. It's worth remembering that data presented on many environmental parameters are simply best estimates. This may not be true of temperatures and rainfall, which can be easily measured, but data, for example, on land degradation, deforestation, and loss of biodiversity are notoriously hard to measure. I used to show this slide for amusement when teaching. I'd gone to Bari in the south of Italy to train some in-service extension agents, and I had expected warm weather. It was snowing. The only way I could keep warm in my room was to use my laptop, well, as a laptop. It was warm and comforting on my knee. But it's not just an amusing anecdote any longer. The climate is changing significantly, though of course it's increases in temperatures that concern us most. Coming back to data, it's not just measurements that are difficult. There's also presentation, especially the use of absolute figures versus percentages. That's something that the media play with when they want to impress people. And current trends continuing? Well, I used to walk towards the window when teaching, and I'd say, if present trends continue, I shall fall out of the building. If you are not sure what causes climate change, and many people frankly are not, then study this diagram. Gases emitted from fossil fuels and other sources, especially carbon dioxide, build up in the atmosphere to create, effectively, a greenhouse. This means that not all radiation from the land can escape. See those circles I've drawn, and heat increasingly builds up. Here's the official definition of climate change, as set out by the authoritative body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Note that climate can change because of natural factors, but it's the anthropogenic, that's the human drivers, that concern us most. So here's a simple explanation of the main anthropogenic causes of climate change, and that's the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And remember, the atmosphere actually begins at ground level. One confusing factor, and you'll see different data presented on this, is the warming effect of various greenhouse gases. The reason is that a gas like methane is very powerful, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere for as long as carbon dioxide. These data here refer to warming potential over 100 years. Carbon dioxide, that's CO2, is taken up by plants from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. It forms carbon-rich matter in plants and in the soil. This, in fact, is the original source of fossil fuels, gas, oil and coal, and when they are burnt, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. But deforestation, land degradation and soil disturbance also allow carbon loss. The increasing buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases means that a catastrophic rise in temperature is expected soon. Land-based solutions, though, can help, and we will examine just how later in the class. Once more, I need to point out some potential confusion in units. I've seen plenty of mistakes being made even in official written documents, and often the units used are not even stated. But whatever the position people take on the environmental debate, there is solid evidence supporting the perilous situation of our climate. It's changing already. It's changed already. Those who deny this are either not very intelligent or have their own agenda for disagreeing. Now, I think it's important in all topics related to SLM and to the environment in general to have an idea of how things have changed over time. For example, when I look through my own files, the earliest reference to climate change that I noted professionally was in 1981. It was an article by Dr. John Gribbin that I cut out and saved. And just look how he depicted the greenhouse effect in this diagram. By the way, you will see that I've supplied you with a list of abbreviations, so you can look up all of these if you're not familiar with them already. There is a COP, as a Conference of Parties, meeting every year. In 2021, it was close to my home in Scotland, but it was rather a depressing meeting. It was accepted that previous targets were not being met, and new resolutions to further cut greenhouse gases were weak. But at least coal was taken into consideration for the very first time. When teaching in the Netherlands, I used to have fun with my students by asking them when the last Elfstedentocht took place. That's a traditional skating race on ice through 11 cities, but it only happens when the ice is consistently deep. The last time was just over 25 years ago now. That's the longest period without racing since the very first Elfstedentocht was skated in 1909. So, what is the source of the greenhouse gases that are the cause of climate change? This overview shows how significant the agriculture, forestry and other land use, or AFOLO sector is. This is basically the contribution of land to climate change. Agriculture is a major emitter of methane and nitrous oxide, while land use change, deforestation and land degradation, emits carbon dioxide. Note that land absorbs carbon dioxide through photosynthesis by growing vegetation, so these emission figures are over and above that process. But here's the main culprit: electricity generation and industry. Between them, they account for nearly half of all greenhouse gases. And that's because burning fossil fuels produces carbon dioxide. It's probably little known, but cement production and the whole process of construction and building and destroying old buildings is a major source of greenhouse gases. Perhaps surprisingly, greenhouse gas emissions from air travel, although very important, don't come near to the level of emissions from the land. Yet very few people know this. Here are examples of land use change. Some we've looked at already. They include deforestation in Ethiopia, conversion of land to settlements in the Philippines, drainage of peatland in England, and burning of bush to make way for rangeland in South Africa. In all of these cases, carbon is lost. Livestock and wildlife too are responsible for a massive amount of methane. And remember that methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. In fact, methane now accounts for an estimated quarter of global warming. And here's possibly another surprising fact. Methane comes from rice paddies also. This is because they're flooded, and anaerobic digestion of organic matter forms methane gas which bubbles up through the water. Rice is by a long way the most climate unfriendly of the world's major cereal crops. Nitrous oxide emissions are largely a byproduct of fertilizer overuse. And, to take it back to livestock, intensive animal production on improved pastures with their single grass varieties and high levels of nitrogen application leads not just to methane emissions, but also nitrous oxide from the fertilizer and too much manure spreading. If you recollect, this was a photo I used in our discussion about losing agrobiodiversity, so a lot of problems are associated with this form of production. Ironically, a production system I was taught as being cutting-edge technology back in the 1970s. Well, we're nearly halfway through today's program. Let's now move on to consider impacts of climate change, both generally and then in the tropics, with a special focus on the poorest countries. Impacts of climate change will be familiar to you. Here's the Aletsch Glacier in Switzerland, a fabulous sight. That's my wife, by the way. I showed that picture while teaching, and then one of my students brought this photo to class, and it illustrated how that glacier has melted over the years. It's dramatic and it's worrying. When I went first to East Africa in the early 1970s, I found the snow on Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro quite spectacular. But there's hardly any left. I didn't have a photo, by the way, of Kilimanjaro to share with you, so I took this advertisement of a Kilimanjaro beer bottle instead. On holiday in Portugal, I took a photo, the one on the left, of what I considered to be a very well constructed discharge waterway. A year later, it had been destroyed by floods. It made me realize that engineering design in soil and water conservation will have to take account of changing weather and rainfall in particular. And it's the poor in the tropics who will suffer most, despite having contributed the least to climate change. They are the most vulnerable and the least able to deal with the consequences of droughts and floods. Please study this list carefully. Note that rising temperatures are just one element of the damaging impacts. That's why we talk of climate change rather than simply global warming. And see how the consequences will not just be the same everywhere, but damage to livelihoods will be widespread. While it may be true that some crops like maize will be grown further north as the climate warms, these increases in production will not compensate for the losses in the tropics. Overall production will be reduced. It's being reduced already. In Kenya's Great Rift Valley, I was always fascinated by how you could drive round a corner and suddenly a whole vista of tea plantations would open up and then abruptly disappear further on as the rainfall or temperature or soil or altitude made it unviable. Well, tea is one of those crops that is very reliant on specific climate combinations. Its comfort zone is very specific. Kenya may soon lose many of its traditional tea growing areas. Rising sea levels are a very clear danger to many low-lying coastal areas, and indeed whole countries in some small island developing states. In wealthier nations there will be more funds and engineering capacity to deal with this, but in Bangladesh, featured here, it's going to be a massive problem. And now we come to the twin strategies to combat climate change: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means reducing the level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Adaptation means dealing with the impacts of climate change. Here I have summarized the difference between mitigation and adaptation with respect to SLM. Sometimes they can both result from the same SLM practice. However, overall, adaptation is very much underplayed and underfinanced. If we're being realistic, adaptation is already needed on a massive scale, and that's the priority for poor countries in the tropics. So mitigation. Well, carbon sequestration means locking away carbon so it can't be lost to the atmosphere. In terms of SLM, our goal is clear. We want to capture and hold carbon in vegetation and in the soil. By doing this, we actually improve production and also make the land healthier, and that's a win-win scenario. Before we go any further, here's a quotation for you from the IPCC in their special publication from 2019, Climate Change and Land. This gives great support to those who promote SLM. Sustainable land management can sometimes reverse the adverse impacts of climate change on land degradation. It can also contribute to mitigation and adaptation. The system of rice intensification, or SRI, is a form of rice production that uses less water, and it reduces methane emissions also. Perhaps 5% of all rice is grown this way, maybe a little more. But in my experience, many practitioners say it increases labour considerably. While it is mainly promoted in Asia, I came across a researcher in Sudan who was working on the system. She was so happy to talk about it. This is a graphic that I developed to help explain the connection between SLM, poverty, and climate change. My aim is to show that land degradation increases climate change and its impacts, and that exacerbates poverty, which in turn means that people are weakened and less able to carry out effective SLM. Thus land degradation increases, and so on. It's a vicious cycle. However, this can be turned on its head, with climate change stimulating responsive action, which then directs more funds and support towards SLM. This can help reduce climate change. And it is certainly true that SLM has received more attention in the last 15 years due to climate change. Many SLM technologies are now looked upon as being climate change adaptation and mitigation actions. You will recollect that we've already talked about RED and RED Plus in Class 1. We come back to it here because it's not just about saving forests, it's also directly linked to climate change mitigation. and I've noted down some facts and figures about progress that has been made under REDD+. Funding of carbon projects became popular in the 2000s, and here's one example from Uganda. However, at the time it did seem strange to me that the money was being distributed, according to the local community, on the basis of pine trees planted and not the islands of indigenous forests protected. But mitigation of climate change, or being green environmentally for that matter, is not just about planting trees. Here are two recent quotes that reflect my experience. There's a lot of global strategies now focused on silver bullets like let's plant trees. But, you should ask, who's going to implement and manage the restoration? Who lives on the land? Who manages and has rights to the land? And the number of tree planting organizations have increased by 288% in the past 30 years. Only 18% mention monitoring at all, and only 5% mention survival rates. If we consider mitigation of climate change through carbon sequestration in the land, then these are typical ranges from the research literature. It's not just planting trees that counts, as many people seem to think, but good land husbandry using SLM has a significant and more widespread impact, and on farmland especially so if it's combined with agroforestry. Grassland improvement can capture huge amounts of carbon too. Here's an estimate of total carbon in the land compared with the atmosphere. See the huge amount in the soil, and it can be increased. Ratan Lal estimates that the soil can sequester enough to offset 25% of the current output of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel, a colossal potential. So, where exactly is this carbon in the land? We've talked about it already, but this is a graphic that summarizes it, so you can see for yourself. It's not just a question of carbon in trees, as the popular media portray. There is indeed above ground vegetation, but then there's harvested wood, dead wood and litter, there's soil organic matter, and there's below ground vegetation and fauna. If we consider forest, then even mature stands of trees continue to lock carbon into the land. So there are carbon as well as biodiversity and ecosystem benefits from protecting existing forest. In terms of trees, protection of mature forests has got to be the priority wherever they exist. Professor Ratan Lal is a prolific writer on soil and soil conservation. Here I have tried to simplify a schematic of his to show how soil erosion and carbon loss are connected. It's not straightforward, as there are detachment, transport and deposition processes throughout. But the bottom box makes the clear point that soil erosion is a strong overall source of carbon loss to the atmosphere. But turning this around, it reinforces what we've been learning today. Sustainable land management is essential and is the key strategy to recarbonize the land. I'll end this section on mitigation with a note about assessment of overall carbon benefits. This is a calculation of how much carbon is sequestered in the land and the amount of greenhouse gases avoided. You can find out more by visiting the references that I've given you here. It's all getting a bit technical now, but don't forget climate change affects people, and especially the poorest in the tropics. I saw this myself with floods, land degradation and crop pests in Madagascar just a few years ago. Is there a role for SLM? Oh yes, most certainly. Climate change adaptation has never had the same high profile as mitigation. Yet for the land-based poor, it's essential for survival. The Economist in an adaptation special report highlights the simple steps that can pay for themselves. You will be familiar with most of these, especially the last two: drought-resistant seed varieties and no-till farming. Naturally, people have always had coping strategies. They've traditionally needed to make provision for natural extreme events. Here's a picture of houses on stilts just outside Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. The point I'm trying to make is that the stilts help cope with changing water levels. But coping is dealing with risks we're aware of. Adaptation means taking new steps to deal with emerging threats. There are many ways that SLM practices can contribute to climate change adaptation. In fact, most practices fit very well. They build up soil health and lead to good vegetative cover. SLM practices also prevent erosion, or in some cases are designed to harvest water where needed. But let's look now at three specific aspects of SLM in relation to adaptation: impact, mechanisms, and attributes. Impacts are what SLM can deliver: soil organic carbon, soil water, biodiversity and soil health. These guard against changes and help stabilize production. Mechanisms are special ways that SLM works to deliver the impacts: developing microenvironments such as windbreaks, buffering like a blanket of mulch, concentrating resources such as in home gardens. And attributes answer the question: how reliable and versatile are SLM practices? These three elements, impacts, mechanisms, and attributes, can be expressed in spider diagrams for specific SLM practices. Let's take agroforestry. Relatively strong in all aspects of mechanisms, agroforestry is especially good at increasing soil organic carbon. It's also very versatile, as there are many different forms of agroforestry, a system for almost any cropland or pasture situation. Water harvesting is different. It rates very highly in creating a localized microenvironment by concentrating water. And soil water is obviously its strongest impact in the semi-arid areas where it is used. But it has little impact on soil organic carbon, except where floodwaters bring large amounts of rich sediment. And it is unreliable, because rains can fail where it is used. Nevertheless, as we've seen, water harvesting can make all the difference between a harvest and crop failure. So we're drawing towards the end of today's class. Let's finish with two closely related themes, both to do with SLM and people, and both sounding a positive note. Firstly, climate smart agriculture, or CSA, which has been promoted by the World Bank for 15 years or so, by the Food and Agricultural Organization too. I was asked to make a presentation in Washington, D.C. back in 2007 to explain how CSA fitted together with SLM. The answer was pretty well. The following slides are drawn from that presentation. I believe they are still valid. CSA stresses the combination of production, climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation. So in this slide, I presented the three key elements of CSA, namely production, mitigation, and adaptation. And here, three key elements of SLM. And then I merged the two together. It seemed to me that they converged neatly, but CSA didn't clearly express conservation of soils and water or ecosystem function. My message was, when formulating plans for CSA, don't lose sight of SLM And don't forget that conservation and ecosystem function need to be kept in mind. Here are 3 examples of CSA in East Africa. In each example, there's attention to crop performance, with mulching, agroforestry, and mixed cropping playing a part. There's also spread of the systems over a significant area. So production, mitigation, adaptation, ecosystem function, and conservation all being catered for. In China, during a presentation, I used an example I'd seen in Guizhou, where the rose, Rosa roxburghii, was being cultivated as a cash crop for jam making from its hips, that's its fruits. But underneath the rose, vegetation was protecting the soil and poultry were free to roam. It was a system that was integrated and resilient. In today's class, I want to stress the point that climate change adaptation is not just about technologies or terminology, it's very much about people. And when we come to SLM and climate change, climate smart or SLM smart people are the most important factor. That's so often ignored. I'm a great believer in local innovation. It's been happening for thousands of years, and it's a key to rising to the challenge of climate change. So, how can we strengthen that capacity? First, it's essential to recognize what people are doing themselves already, more than you might think. Adaptation strategies require a particular skill set. Nevertheless, many of these skills are already inherent in people and in their communities, but they are skills that need to be stimulated and sharpened. So preparedness, risk spreading, opportunism, creativity and innovation, and the joining of hands with scientists in what I like to call hybrid knowledge. And here are more examples of where individuals or communities, women or men, have surprised me with their ability to think through the problems and come up with tailor-made solutions. Several of these I've shown you before. All are documented in the various references I've given you, but I've added notes to each to show what people are doing and where. One common denominator is that the rural poor are driven to solve problems for themselves and their communities. That means that they will, quite rightly, be drawn primarily towards adaptation for their own benefit. That's one important lesson to be learned. Now, I don't know who you are. I can't see you, but I hope that you too, like this group I taught in Amsterdam a few years back, will have become climate smart as well. Finally, as always, some take-home points. Once again, I hope you've enjoyed the class today and learned a lot. Join me again next time when we round the course off with the enabling environment to SLM. If you've no idea what I mean, well, just wait. It will all make sense. Bye for now.